briefly. So Dr. Robinson's teaching and research have been concerned primarily with three main areas. The first is the European tradition of thought that emerged from Kant and post-Kantian philosophy, especially in 19th and 20th century continental thinkers, Nietzsche, Foucault, Deleuze. And secondly, he has a strong interest in modern process philosophy, such as James Bergson and Whitehead. And finally, he is interested in the interconnections between these two areas. So, and that last area of research has revolved around a critical exchange between perspectives drawn from post-structuralist and process thinkers. And it has centered principally on temporal themes, especially the concepts of event and process across the range of contexts and problems. And Dr. Robinson has already published his own one book with a second in preparation, I've heard that, and two edited books, book collections, and two special journal issues, and some 30 published articles and chapters in books, along with several invited conference presentations. So, Keith, go ahead. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much to the Global Bergsonism Project for organizing this conference. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. So the title of my paper, as you heard, is the Epochal in Bergson and Whitehead. So I'll just jump straight into it. Bergson and Whitehead were near contemporaries in the early decades of the 20th century. They wrote on similar themes and praised each other's work in print. However, the scholarship exploring the connections between Bergson and Whitehead remains in its infancy, despite a significant number of scholars recognizing similarities between them. There are barely a handful of monographs devoted to exploring the connections between their work, either in English or French, and journal articles explicitly focusing on the two are still relatively rare. In the scholarship on Bergson, few discuss Whitehead's work in depth. This may be a result of the continuing effects of the analytic continental split, with many Bergson scholars emerging from a background in French and German thought. On the Whitehead side, perhaps a handful of scholars have read Bergson's work carefully. In part, this is a reflection of the complex reception of Whitehead's thought through the pre- and post-Second World War years. One example in relation to the latter is Victor Lowe, Whitehead's biographer, who was influential in shaping the post-war reception of Whitehead's thought. Lowe published a paper in 1949 entitled The Influence of Bergson, James, and Alexander on Whitehead that may have directly dissuaded scholars from even reading Bergson, let alone pursuing connections with Whitehead. In his article and Lowe's book, Understanding Whitehead, which includes a version of the article, Lowe gives a survey of the problems and solutions that interested Whitehead and compares these with Bergson. Throughout, Lowe insists that Bergson was not an influence on Whitehead, but he doesn't rest there. Lowe goes much further. Quote, "It is fatal," he writes, "to the understanding of Whitehead's constructive metaphysical effort to define it in Bergsonian terms." End quote. In his book, Lowe says that Whitehead's thought is, quote, "of an entirely different type from the French philosophers," i.e. Bergson's, end quote. As Whitehead's biographer, Lowe's article and book had a seal of authority gleaned from years of scholarly work on Whitehead, as well as extensive communication with and personal knowledge of him. One purpose of this paper is to argue against Lowe that the connections between Bergson and Whitehead are deep and illuminating. In this paper, I won't consider the question of influence. This can be seen in relation to numerous topics, including their shared critical diagnoses of the scientific and philosophical traditions, as well as their ideas on creativity, life, mind, memory, extensive abstraction, and many others besides. In addition, a second purpose is to show where their thought might begin to differ. One of the key problems that I will focus on here, and that Lowe discusses, goes to the conceptual heart of the connections between the two, the theory of epochal time-space. Whitehead is well known for his theory of actual occasions, and Bergson for durée. However, Whitehead's theory is often called an epochal theory of time by himself and others, including Lowe. Indeed, at various points, Whitehead refers to his theory of time as atomic. Bergson's duration is often held to be continuous, or at least in some sense opposed to the atomic. Lowe, quoting Bergson, claims that duration is, quote, a pure, unadulterated inner continuity, a continuity which was neither unity or multiplicity, and which did not fit into any of the categories of our thought, end quote. Lowe argues that continuity is a fundamental fact of Bergson's duration, but for Whitehead, continuity is a surface feature prominent in consciousness. That's what Lowe argues. The underlying reality are drops of experience, which we do not find in Lowe's Bergson. Lowe sets out the stakes thus, quote, the student of these philosophers would do well to bear constantly in mind that nothing in Bergson's thought corresponds to the three conceptions, actual entity, prehension, and nexus, end quote. These are three famous concepts from Whitehead's metaphysics. Contra Lowe, I will argue that Bergson's duration comes very close to Whitehead's drops or epochal occasions, and that one can find something close to prehensions and nexus in Bergson, although I won't discuss the latter two notions here today. Although they share a similar understanding of space-time as epochal, one apparent difference is their treatment of Zeno, and this is directly related to their notions of the epochal. The two thinkers seem to approach Zeno from the opposing side, but from different starting points. Whitehead begins with the problem of infinite divisibility and regress, and posits indivisible epochal occasions as a response, whereas Bergson begins with the idea of indivisible durations and responds to the problem of their reduction to the divisible. For Whitehead, Zeno's paradoxes are formative for his own conception of time and process, such that there can only be, as he says, a becoming of continuity. That's a quote from Whitehead. For Bergson, by contrast, Zeno's paradoxes are false problems, because essentially they rely upon a spatialized conception of time and movement that covers over the continuity of becoming. Okay, so I've got a first section on Whitehead, and then a section on Bergson, and then a kind of short conclusion. So section on Whitehead, then on the epochal. Lowe argues for a simple opposition between Bergson and Whitehead on the epochal. Bergson, he claims, is the thinker of continuity, and epochality is a mere spatialized appearance, whereas Whitehead is the thinker of epochs, and continuity is a surface feature of consciousness. This is not just Lowe's view. Other scholars, for example, via Chapel, work with similar distinctions. There are a whole bunch of scholars that I can name here that seem to work on this kind of distinction. Taken across their works as a whole, this opposition gets, from what I'm going to argue, gets both Bergson and Whitehead wrong. So let's take Whitehead first. In both Science and the Modern World and Process and Reality, Whitehead argues for the reality of time as a becoming of continuity. Again, that's Whitehead's phrase, but not a continuity of becoming. Although on the surface this appears to support Lowe's view, what Whitehead means here is that there is a dynamic becoming of continuity, but no mathematical continuity of becoming. Rather than a mere surface feature of consciousness, as Lowe suggests, the structure of continuity in what Whitehead calls the actual occasion can be traced to the metaphysical condition of time, since its general function in Whitehead is to mediate between past and future. For one element to be continuous with another, it must conform to the immediate past and anticipate the immediate future. Whitehead is very close to William James's famous description of a specious present, albeit generalized beyond the stream of consciousness, to indicate that experience never captures the individual present moments of a now, but only a present that stretches back into the past and forward into the future. The present is specious in that it's never immediately available in an instantaneous now moment, knife edge or atomic sensation as such, but only in a block or an epoch that stretches through a continuity of immediate past and future moments. However, like James, the block or durational act itself for Whitehead is not a continuity, at least in a mathematical sense. Only the moments in the duration are felt continuously. Whitehead not only adopts the phrase specious present and the idea that individual units of experience come in epochs, but he also accepts James's view that although the percipient event is temporally extended, the act of temporalization is itself a unity that is unextended and indivisible. In other words, the content of the units of experience or actual occasions undergo temporal extension, but the form remains unextended. Whitehead writes, quote, "Temporalization is not another continuous process. It is an atomic succession. Thus, time is atomic, i.e. epochal, though what is temporalized is divisible," end quote. That's a quote from Science and the Modern World. Time is the succession of epochs, but the entities which succeed each other are durations with divisible parts. The realization or succession of the epochs isn't through the divisible parts, but according to Whitehead, given with the parts. What is given with the parts is a unifying epoch or indivisible unit that doesn't have actual temporal extension, but a potentiality that endures with extension. In other words, Whitehead's notion of atomicity here cannot be a form of instantaneity as such, but an event that coincides with the whole epoch which it creates in its becoming. This is Whitehead's and James's response to Zeno. As Whitehead puts it, quote, "If we admit that something becomes, it's easy by employing Zeno's method to prove that there can be no continuity of becoming. There is becoming of continuity, but no continuity of becoming," end quote. That's quite a well-used line from Whitehead's Process and Reality. Units of experience or epochal occasions become, and they constitute together an extensive world in which only extensiveness becomes, quote, "but becoming is not extensive," end quote. Becoming occurs within the process, but the act of continuity occurs all at once, so that reality grows for Whitehead, just as it does for James, by, quote, "buds or drops of perception," end quote. And that's a quote both, by the way, from Whitehead and William James. You can divide the experience analytically upon reflection, but as it's immediately given, it's all or nothing. Thus, Whitehead writes, quote, "The conclusion is that in every act of becoming, there is the becoming of something with temporal extension, but the act itself is not extensive. in the sense that it's divisible into earlier and later acts of becoming, which correspond to the extensive divisibility of what has become, end quote. So Whitehead distinguishes here, and this is my terminology, so I should probably stress that. Whitehead distinguishes here the form of becoming, the structure of the act of experience, from the content. So I'm using this form-content distinction, but Whitehead doesn't use it, and to my knowledge, none of the commentators use that distinction in talking about the actual occasion. So I want to work with this kind of form-content distinction. So Whitehead distinguishes the form of becoming, the structure of the act of experience, from the content in which something becomes, in order to shore up the infinite regress that Zeno's paradox threatens. The epochal structure of occasions is supposed to put an end to temporal regression, but by being constitutive of itself and providing a unity and synthesis to the becoming so that it doesn't continue without origin or end. And that seems to be Whitehead's concern here, or worry. If we analyze the act of becoming with the premises that something becomes and that every act of becoming is divisible into earlier acts of becoming, then we end up in the contradiction of an infinite regress where nothing becomes. To use Whitehead's own example, if we take an act of becoming during 1 second, we can divide that act into two, namely the act of becoming in the first half of the second and the act of becoming in the second half of the second. Operating with the above premises, quote, that which becomes during the whole second presupposes that which becomes during the first half of the second. Analogously, that which becomes during the first half second presupposes that which becomes during the first quarter second, and so on indefinitely, end quote. Again, that's a quote from Process and Reality. If we consider the process of becoming up to the beginning of the second in question and ask what becomes, Whitehead concludes, quote, no answer can be given, end quote. So infinite regress leads to a contradiction in the notion of becoming, because if the act of becoming is itself temporally divisible, it cannot act as a synthetic unity for something to become, but must itself be subject to further acts of becoming. Fundamentally for Whitehead, no movement or process of reality can be self-constituting if it's subject to the temporalization of pure becoming. Indeed, Whitehead writes, quote, these conclusions are required by the consideration of Zeno's argument. Okay, so I've tried to explain there why Whitehead introduces this notion of the epoch or the epochal occasion, the actual entity or the actual occasion, and why he does it by drawing on James, because he's responding to this problem as he sees it of infinite regress, the Zeno problem. And I think it's a very different way of responding to Zeno from Bergson. So now I want to say something about Bergson and then try and wrap this up. So Bergson's continuity of becoming is based on a rejection, like Whitehead's, of mathematical continuity. Mathematical continuity is based on the premise of the infinitely divisible and is for Bergson to treat becoming in terms of instants or geometric points that are external and juxtaposed to each other. These latter are abstractions good for action, but not speculation. Rather, durations come with their own determined rhythm, as Bergson puts it, and that's a quote. Indeed, there is no one rhythm of duration, but multiple with differing speeds and slownesses. Although Lowe, quoting Bergson, refers to an inner continuity, the rhythms of duration are not exclusively psychological and are ascribed to matter, where elementary vibrations are said to have elementary matter. The rhythms of duration are structured by spatiotemporal features of becoming. So continuity, heterogeneity, in short, what Bergson calls qualitative multiplicity, that give duration its degrees of intensive unity, synthesis, and epochality. Bergson realized early on that mechanistic systems, and more generally what he called positive science, could not come to terms with real duration. Positive science is rooted in a metaphysics that goes back to the school of Elia, which substitutes the concept or the idea for the percept. If the earliest thinkers attempted to break with action by turning away from the percept to the idea, for Bergson they did so on the basis that they could grasp movement directly. At the beginning of Western metaphysics, Bergson claims it is Zeno who, by drawing out the contradictions of movement and change, quote, led the philosophers, Plato first and foremost, to seek the true and coherent reality in what does not change, end quote. But why did they turn to what does not change? For Bergson, it's because these philosophers believe that in its ordinary operations, perception and consciousness deliver change and movement to us. From there, it can be shown easily that change leads to insoluble contradictions and the creation of the paradoxes of movement and change. Zeno's paradoxes for Bergson all attempt to show that movement and change lead to insoluble contradictions, but all trade on an illusion whereby real movement is confused with immobilities or static self-identical units. For Bergson, this is because we associate the movement with the line or spatial trajectory that comes in the movement's wake. As Bergson puts it, quote, Zeno's illusion arises from this, and this is a famous text, that the movement, once affected, has laid along its course a motionless trajectory on which we can count as many immobilities as we will. From this, we conclude that the movement, whilst being affected, lays at each instant beneath it a position with which it coincides, end quote. For example, in response to Zeno's Achilles paradox, Bergson argues that Achilles' steps are a simple series of indivisible acts that cannot be reduced to the divisible space that underlies them. The indivisible acts of Achilles' steps are essentially epochal durations that are then reduced to the line or spatial trace that underlies them. For Bergson, we tend to think of movement and change in terms of immobile states that are pieced together to constitute the change or movement. Although we talk about change, Bergson thinks that we, quote, reason and philosophize as though change did not exist, end quote. The example Bergson returns to again and again is the simple movement of my arm from A to B. Our habits of thought are such that to understand this movement, we divide the space between A and B into so many immobile points in between. But Bergson says change and movement cannot coincide with the immobile and simply present points of the space through which my arm moves. This habit of thought may be good for action, but not for speculation. If we apply this habit of thought to speculation, Bergson says that, quote, you at once cause insoluble metaphysical problems to arise. In other words, Zeno creates these contradictions out of his paradoxes because he transfers to the moving body the properties of its trajectory. In the interests of utility, common sense, and language, collude in this transfer by treating movement and change in terms of space. As Bergson says, common sense and language have a right to do this, since, quote, they have no more concern with the interior organization of movement than a workman has with the molecular structure of his tools, end quote. This is what Bergson famously calls spatialization and has been the source of much confusion and misunderstanding. I have a section on spatialization, but I think I'm going to leave that out for now because time seems to be passing very quickly, but maybe if somebody wants to mention it, we can talk about it in the Q&A. I think Whitehead misunderstands Bergson on this. There's some famous points that Bergson makes about spatialization that Whitehead, I think, would not agree with. It's intuition in Bergson that struggles with spatialization. The French philosopher Gilles Deleuze stressed that intuition is a method in Bergson. It is, as he puts it, quote, one of the most fully developed methods in philosophy, end quote. Thus, as a fully worked out method, intuition ought not to be contrasted with intellect as such, which is really, I think, where Whitehead goes wrong when he talks about spatialization. Rather, it should be contrasted with habitual and spatialized modes of intellect. Intuition is a labor or effort to discard the common sense forms of intelligence tied to utility in favor of a new, fluid forms of conceptuality capable of engaging the immediate data of consciousness. The immediate data of consciousness, the immediate data or content of intuition is, of course, Hirai. In response to Zeno, Bergsonian change needs to be conceived as pure mobility without a self-present underlying thing or substratum that supports the change, and this is what duration is. But in addition to continuity, there's a second feature of duration, and this is really where the sort of notion of the epochal side of duration comes in. And we can just simply call it the heterogeneous. It is this feature that shows how a multiplicity of elements in becoming form a temporal epoch. In other words, if the continuity of becoming implies creativity, novelty, and the new, there must be qualitative or heterogeneous differences in the continuity. Some may claim that an indivisible continuity of becoming eliminates distinctions between the phases of duration, but this would be to confuse an absence of divisibility with an absence of difference. Bergson's suggestion here is that there appears to be a contradiction between continuity and heterogeneity only if we insist on understanding the terms mathematically, quantitatively, or in terms of certain presupposed logical principles. But clearly Bergson wants to get at experiences that resist translation into mathematical, arithmetic, or presupposed rational terms. One of Bergson's favorite examples here is our experience of a melody. In listening to a melody, we have an experience of a change that endures. Although the tone, the pitch, and the timbre might be the same as a second ago, what enables novelty to emerge is that the antecedent phase is still there, providing a qualitative difference in our experience of past and present. Thus, continuity.
Sorry for interrupting. So, your time has passed. So, would you are you ending in 0 minutes?
I can wrap this up in a couple of minutes. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Go ahead.
So basically, in this section, I was going to talk about the way in which one could talk about the notion of duration as a kind of rhythm of heterogeneity and continuity. That's essentially what I was going to say in that section. I just want to read. I've got a couple of paragraphs to wrap up. So this will be the final for a couple of minutes. Whitehead's approach to Zeno is different from Bergson's, and this has important implications for the conceptions of the epochal view of time-space. In several books, Whitehead treats Zeno's paradoxes, especially the arrow, in terms of what he calls a valid argument, and never mentions its reliance upon spatialized or simply located concepts. Whitehead never accuses Zeno of falling foul of what he calls the fallacy of simple location or misplaced concreteness. Whitehead takes Zeno's paradoxes seriously because for him, they demonstrate how becoming without synthesis is caught up in an endless division and infinite regress. For Whitehead, this regress is unthinkable and must be avoided. Otherwise, as he says, quote, time would be an irrational notion, as he puts it. And so he develops this notion drawn from James of the idea of the epochal bud. For Bergson, in contrast, there's no need to posit, if you like, a formal unit without extension to perform the work of synthesis. For Bergson, this solution requiring the positing of a type of atomicity remains too close to a restatement of essentially what we could call the paradox of becoming, and risks remaining mired in the false problems generated by Zeno's paradoxes. So essentially, I think the distinction here is that Whitehead seems to think he requires a kind of formal epochal unity here. And I think in doing so, he flirts almost with falling back into what we can call the Eleatic fallacy. But I think Bergson, in his response to Zeno, is clearly trying to get out of. There's a lot more I could say here, but clearly I've run out of time. So I'll finish up there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a brilliant talk. And sorry for interrupting while you are ending. But anyway, so we have only 10 minutes for discussion. So if you have any questions, you will raise your hand virtually. So as a function of the Zoom. So is anyone asking any question? Okay, Deborah.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Kate. I would like to thank you very much for your presentation. It's a fascinating subject. And I must say that I don't know Whitehead's philosophy, but I think I understood some points of your presentation. And I have two little questions. Both of them, Bergson and Whitehead, they try to avoid atomist conception of time, okay? And both of them were very influenced by Zeno's arguments. Then my question is first about epochal, the notion of epochal. Doesn't refusing mathematical continuity and divisibility into instants in the name of the notion of epochal, in the case of Whitehead, doesn't this just mean switching from instant to block, even if block is a notion that is marked by a qualitative element?
Sorry, what was that last point?
The qualitative mark, a block of time.
Yes.
That compose the notion of epochal is a qualitative mark, a qualitative difference, okay? But even though we can say that this conception is spatial, is a spatial conception of time, even if there is a mark that is phenomenal or qualitative. And the second question is, what is the significance for philosophical method that the two response to Zeno arguments? Because I think that Whitehead remains in a logical mathematical method. This means that the different conception ontologically determined about time doesn't mean a changement of method. And in the case of Bergson, we know he will refuse, not completely, but partially, logical mathematical method to take account of the time. I don't know if it's confused, but my question are confused, but it's something like this. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, two really interesting questions. So I think if I've understood you on the first question, this question about the block. Now, what my concern, what my worry is here about Whitehead is because he's drawing on James to respond to Zeno, he has an understanding of the block which risks falling into a kind of an atomicity in the sense of being a timeless block. Right, that's the concern. I think in James that's the case. In other words, the content, the species present in James, right, the stream of consciousness has the structure of protension, retention, and so on, operating at that level of a percipient event, of a perceived duration, a perceived intuition. But that notion of the act of the percipient event in James, I think, is timeless. It's not theorized in James. It's almost a kind of timeless act. And my worry is that at certain points in Whitehead's work, he falls into that terminology, that language, especially in Process and Reality. More and more he starts using this atomistic language, right? And so he's flirting almost, I think, with falling into what I earlier called the Eleatic fallacy, right? Which I think Bergson is at pains to kind of avoid this, to critique this. Okay, so that's the first question I think you asked. This is the notion of the qualitative block. Right, the qualitative block itself in Bergson is temporalized. Right, so both the form and the content, to use the language that I'm using here, both the content of the perception and the act are temporalized in Bergson. Right, very clearly so, and I think that comes out in his response to Zeno. Whereas Whitehead's response to Zeno, he comes at it from from this kind of Jamesian articulation of the problem. And what worries me about it is that sometimes he uses language that sort of risks falling into a pure kind of atomistic conception. So that's the first question, and you might want to, maybe I haven't understood your question, maybe you want to come back on that. The second part of your question was about method, and I don't really want to throw a question back at you as an answer to that question, but I'm tempted to by saying, well, why would you assert that Whitehead's method here is mathematical or logical? You know, where are you drawing that from?
Because of his preoccupation about contradiction, maybe, and also because he is a mathematician.
Yeah, it's a very difficult kind of point. It's one that, in some places in Process and Reality, like the one I've been talking about, where he's talking about Zeno, he seems to be worried about contradiction. But then at other points, he's much more relaxed about the notion of contradiction. And I think there's a much bigger story here to tell about Whitehead and the path out of Principia, about where Whitehead goes in terms of his movement, his path, his sort of intellectual development out of Principia Mathematica. Because it's a critical path away from a logicist and mathematicist conception of philosophical work, right? And I think that's seen in Process and Reality and the whole kind of metaphysics that Whitehead develops. It's not, I wouldn't call it a logical or mathematical program at all. In fact, I would call it a kind of critique of that. I mean, really, that's really one of the points around which Whitehead and Russell separate. I think that's what's going on between them. Russell wants to continue this kind of logical path, right, of converting philosophical problems into logical problems eventually. Whereas Whitehead, I think, is moving on another path, much closer to Bergson. So I should probably stop there. Does that help? Does that answer some of your questions?
Yes, sure. Yes.
Okay,
thank you very
so,
much, Kate.
Thank you.
So now we're running out of time, but we have already from a question from Victor Kundulu in the chat box. It is written that do you think Whitehead would think of Bergson as a philosopher that bifurcate nature? Can you understand the question quickly?
Yeah.
And answer? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's a famous phrase in Whitehead, the idea of the bifurcation of nature. No, I don't think, I mean, the references to Bergson that Whitehead makes are usually very positive comments. There's really only a couple of critical comments. And the critical comments really come up in relation to the notion of spatialization. I don't think Whitehead would think of Bergson as a thinker who bifurcates nature. I think he would think of Bergson as somebody who's trying to overcome the bifurcation of nature, and precisely in the kinds of ways that Whitehead is, right? By trying to develop a new metaphysics grounded in a new conception of spatiotemporality, which leaves behind mechanistic conceptions of time as instantaneous and a whole kind of metaphysics of presence, right, that Bergson and Whitehead are trying to depart from. Sorry, I tried to keep that short.
Okay, thank you very
It's a
much.
very interesting question, and there's a lot more we could say.
Great. And maybe Said, could you yeah,
thank you,
question.
Yasushi, and I thank Professor Robinson for his clear and very rich presentation. I just want to ask if we could have a direct link between Bergsonian concept of duration, which connects past, present, and future, and Whitehead's becoming, concept of becoming, which then turned into process philosophy. Is this the main, maybe probably connection between the two, which was seen by Lowe and others as the influence or very close? And also, I mean, Whitehead himself gave some sort of acknowledgement of Bergson in his books. And secondly, there were also some criticism of Lowe in later articles about, like, this is, I mean, by Whiteheadian philosophy is totally different. We cannot see a total influence. What do you think about later also criticisms of this Lowe's argument? Thank you.
Thank you. So yes, I mean, I think they're clearly doing something very similar in terms of their conceptions of space and time. It's just they're using very different terminology, and they're coming out of very different traditions in some ways. And so it makes it very difficult to see that they're doing the same thing. Whitehead's invented his own terminological vocabulary, and it takes a while to figure it out. You know, so he's got a whole set of terms that make it very difficult to access his work and see the kinds of connections that might be drawn there between Bergson and Whitehead. But for sure, they're definitely doing the same kind of things, and they recognize that in each other. Bergson read Whitehead's concept of nature and was very appreciative of Whitehead's book, The Concept of Nature. It's hard to figure out what Whitehead read of Bergson. He's clearly read some of Bergson. How much of Bergson, I'm not really sure. Whether he's read, for example, he's definitely read Time and Free Will, or what gets translated as Time and Free Will in the English. Whether he's read Creative Evolution, I don't know, but they're definitely, their projects are, you know, very convergent, I think. On the second question about criticisms of Lowe, yeah, can you say a little bit more? I'm not sure who you're referring to.
I just saw some articles later. But I cannot give details of the articles. I thought maybe you were. I can send you the articles later.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, I think a lot of other commentators, Whiteheadian scholars, have been critical of Lowe. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Lowe had a big influence in that kind of, as I said earlier, the post-war reception, post-Second World War reception of Whitehead's thought, simply because he knew Whitehead personally. He was the biographer. They knew each other intimately, really. They met on a regular basis every day.
Okay. Sorry,
No. I'll stop.
We have no time, so thank you very much, because it's very interesting questions. But I also have a question, but I would like to write down in the chat box after that. So okay. I need to wrap up this first speaker session. Thank you very much for Keith Robinson. Very fascinating and interesting paper and talk and discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.
And this